Rain slid down the tall glass windows of the coal industries building. Morning traffic below sounded like a restless sea. Inside, Ethan Cole sat behind his wide desk, tapping a pen against the corner of a file. He was known for being calm and strict. At 35, he had built his company from a small startup into one of the city's biggest names. People said his face never showed surprise and his voice never shook, no matter what happened. That morning, his assistant knocked on the door and entered with a strange look. Her voice hesitated as she said there was a problem with the next interview. Ethan checked the time and frowned. His schedule was tight. He expected another late applicant or perhaps someone who had forgotten their documents. He told his assistant to send them in quickly. The office door opened slowly. Little girl stepped inside. Her shoes were too big, her skirt too long, and she carried a folder almost as large as her chest. Her hair had been tied into a ponytail that was already falling apart. She stood straight like someone who had decided she would not cry, no matter what. Ethan blinked. He thought perhaps it was a joke. The girl walked toward the desk and spoke in a quiet, careful voice. She said, "Mom's ill, so I came instead." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. He had heard many excuses in business, but never a child's voice saying such a thing. His assistant stood frozen near the door, waiting for a reaction. Ethan rose from his chair and came closer. He asked her name. She said she was Lila Harper, and that her mother, Claire Harper, had applied for the secretary position. Her mother had a fever and could not get up, but she told Lila that it was an important interview, and she could not miss it. So Lila had packed the folder and taken the bus by herself. Ethan lowered himself to one knee so he could look at her eye level. He asked gently if her mother knew she was here. Lila nodded. She said her mom was worried, but she had promised not to talk to strangers. She explained that Ethan was not a stranger because his name was on the form, and that made it official. Something in her small, precise words made Ethan smile in spite of himself. He told her to sit in the chair across from his desk. Her legs dangled far above the floor, and she placed the folder on the desk with both hands. Inside were printed copies of her mother's resume and a note written in a shaking hand. Ethan unfolded the note. It read that Claire was sorry for not making it and that she hoped to reschedule. The letter was polite and humble. He looked at the child again and saw the reflection of tired days behind her smile. I thought about the rules he usually followed. He did not waste time, never allowed interruptions, and disliked sentimental stories. But he found himself asking questions anyway. He asked where they lived, how old she was, and if her mother had been working lately. Lila answered each question carefully, as if she were in school. Said her mother had lost her last job when the company closed. They had moved into a small apartment, and her mother had been looking for work ever since. Ethan felt a thin ache in his chest. He remembered being poor once when he used to wear his father's old shirts. He had forgotten that feeling long ago. The little girl's courage reminded him of that hunger to survive. He told her he would visit her mother that afternoon instead of rescheduling the interview. Lila's eyes lit up with surprise. She asked if that meant her mother still had a chance. Ethan smiled and said everyone deserved a fair chance. The little girl stood, reached across the desk, and held out her small hand. He shook it carefully. Her grip was steady and serious. After she left with his assistant, Ethan sat back down and looked at the rain again. The city outside had not changed, but something in his office had. On the side of his desk lay the handwritten note and a child S drawing that had slipped from the folder. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands under a big yellow sun. He told himself it was only a small act of kindness. Yet a thought lingered that this small meeting might not be small at all. He could not explain why the sound of that little voice stayed in his ears, long after the door closed. The rain had stopped by the time Ethan's car reached the old part of the city. The streets were narrow and filled with puddles that reflected the gray sky. He checked the paper Lila had given him with their address and looked at the small apartment building that leaned slightly to one side. It did not look safe, but it was clean. A few flowers and old coffee cans grew along the windowsills. He knocked on the door, and a weak voice answered from inside. A moment later, a pale woman opened it. Her hair was messy, and her eyes looked tired but kind. She must have guessed who he was because her face turned red with worry. She tried to stand straight, though her hands trembled slightly. She said her name was Claire Harper, and she was so sorry about that morning. She explained that she had fainted just after getting ready to leave, and her daughter had gone without telling her at first. Ethan told her it was all right. He had come to check on her, not to scold her. Inside, the apartment was small but tidy. A few drawings covered the walls, the smell of soap mixed with a faint scent of tea. Lila sat at the table, coloring a picture, and her face brightened when she saw Ethan. She jumped down and hurried to bring him a chair. He sat feeling larger than he had in any meeting room. He asked Claire about her health and told her he had seen her note. She seemed nervous but grateful. She said she had been looking for work for months. She had once worked as a receptionist, then an office coordinator, but when her company closed, she had to take smaller jobs just to pay rent. Her voice was tired, but never bitter. Ethan listened without interrupting. He had heard plenty of people explain failures in interviews before, but this was different. Claire's words had no excuses in them, only plain truth. It made him think of the early days when he had started his first business from a basement. He asked if she still wanted the job. Claire looked surprised and then said yes quickly. He told her she could start on a trial period for 4 weeks. Her eyes widened and she pressed her hands to her mouth. Leela ran around the table shouting that her mom got hired. Ethan smiled, feeling something inside him loosen. He had not planned to hire anyone that day. Yet as he looked at their faces, he felt the choice was right. He left the building feeling lighter than he had in years. The next Monday, Claire came to the office. She wore simple clothes, neat and respectful. Her shy smile greeted everyone. Some coworkers whispered about her sudden hire, but she ignored it and focused on learning the tasks. She handled calls calmly, organized files quickly, and worked late without complaint. In 1 week, she fixed 3 scheduling mistakes that had been confusing the department for months. Ethan watched quietly from a distance. He did not want to make her nervous, but he noticed small things that impressed him. When people argued, she spoke softly and brought them back to reason. When someone dropped their folder, she was the first to help. She treated everyone as if their work mattered. Each evening when the building emptied, Ethan would look through the glass walls of her department. Claire would still be there, cleaning her desk, checking tomorrow's list, and smiling at her phone when Lila called. He found himself standing there longer each time before heading home. A few times, Leela visited after school, wearing her school uniform and carrying a lunchbox. She would wave from Claire's desk and bring cookies for everyone. The staff began to wait for those visits, like children waiting for recess. The girls' laughter lifted the place in a way no memo or meeting could. Ethan asked Claire one afternoon if her daughter liked the office. Claire laughed softly and said Leela had decided she wanted to be a boss someday because the boss had the biggest window. Ethan pretended to be serious and said he should be careful then because Lila might take his job in 20 years. For the first time in a long while, he found himself laughing. It was not the polite laugh he used at dinners or meetings. It was real and unguarded. His assistant later noticed the change and told him he looked brighter. He only shrugged and said some people bring fresh air with them wherever they go. By the end of the month, Claire's trial period ended. Ethan called her into his office. She looked worried again, holding her notebook close to her chest. Asked if she liked her work. She said she did, and he told her she was now a permanent employee. For a second, she just stared at him, unable to speak, and then thanked him again and again. After she left, Ethan looked out at the city. The glass reflected his face, but in it, he saw how different he seemed from the man who once thought kindness slowed success. He did not know what life would make of this new chapter, but he felt sure it had already made him better. The weeks that followed were busy ones at Coal Industries. Claire settled into her new role quickly. She arrived early each morning with a calm smile and left late after finishing every detail on her list. She became known as the person everyone could rely on. If a printer jammed or a meeting was forgotten, Claire fixed it with quiet care. People began to trust her almost instantly. Ethan noticed how the work environment seemed lighter with her around. The sound of arguments dropped, and even the rushed staff at the front desk looked less tense. She carried an air of patience that made people feel safe. Ethan often found himself stopping by her department for what he called quick checks. Those quick checks sometimes turned into short conversations that stretched into minutes. He told himself it was part of management, yet inside he knew it was more than that. Claire never tried to impress him. She spoke gently, but confidently about work, about raising Lila, about simple things like the best bus routes or cheap groceries. Ethan listened more than he talked, something his board members would have found hard to believe. She reminded him of what life looked like outside the walls of high offices. On Fridays, the entire building seemed to come alive when Lila stopped by after school. She brought energy that reached every corner. The security guards greeted her by name. The front desk staff waved at her through glass panels. Lila carried a small bag of homemade cookies, which she shared generously with everyone. She always made sure to keep the last two for her mother and Ethan. One afternoon, the three of them sat in the break room drinking milkshakes that Lila insisted they try. Claire laughed at the white foam sticking to her daughter's lip, while Ethan watched them with quiet joy. For years, he had thought success was about numbers on screens and reports in folders. That afternoon, seeing the little girl giggle and Claire's eyes glow with life, he wondered if he had misunderstood what success truly meant. However, feelings like this were new to him and not entirely comfortable. One evening after everyone had left, he stayed in his office longer than usual, stared at the city lights, and thought about how his daily routine could become a cage. Claire had never said anything personal to him that crossed the line, yet her presence had changed him deeply. He questioned when admiration had turned into something warmer. The next morning, he decided to keep things professional. He tried to avoid walking by her department and spoke through his assistant when he could, but it did not last long. By the second day, he saw her helping an older staff member carry a heavy box and caught himself smiling again, pretending indifference had never been his strength. One evening, as employees gathered near the elevators, the sky grew dark without warning. A storm began outside. Claire hesitated at the door, waiting for the rain to slow, but it only grew stronger. She said she would take the bus anyway, since she had promised Lila she would be home soon. Ethan happened to pass by and offered her a ride. She refused at first, but the lightning outside made her change her mind. During the drive, they talked about Lila's school projects and the art fair she wanted to join. Claire explained they did small painting sessions at home on weekends, turning their living room into a studio. Ethan listened closely, feeling warmth spread in his chest. When he dropped her at her building, Claire thanked him and said she did not like burdening others. He told her it was no burden at all. For a moment, silence held between them, filled with rain sounds and something unspoken. The days rolled on, and spring arrived. The company had a charity event in the park. Claire helped organize it, and Ethan insisted she lead the project. Lila came along wearing a ribbon in her hair and handing out lemonade to volunteers. Claire worked so hard that she barely noticed Ethan watching her from across the field. When their eyes met, she smiled shyly, and Ethan looked away, pretending to check his phone. At the end of the day, as they cleaned up the tables, Lila proudly announced that their lemonade stand had raised more money than any other corner. Ethan lifted her up high and thanked her for being the best helper in the company. Claire looked at them, her heart warm but uncertain. Part of her wanted to run from the confusion starting to grow. She had built her life carefully around duty and safety, not love. Yet when she saw how Ethan looked at her daughter with genuine affection, she found it hard to hold that wall for long. When the sun set and the event ended, Ethan helped them pack their supplies into his car again. On the drive home, Lila fell asleep in the back seat, her head resting on a soft blanket. Claire sat quietly beside Ethan, her hands folded on her lap. He said little, but the silence between them was full and gentle. For the first time in a long while, neither of them felt alone. The summer heat arrived faster than anyone expected. The tall buildings shimmered in the sunlight, and inside Coal Industries work grew busier than ever. Claire continued to work hard, balancing her hours at the office with her responsibilities at home. She began to feel tired more often, but said nothing to anyone. She did not want Ethan or her coworkers to worry. She told herself it was only stress and that she only needed to rest more. Ethan noticed small changes in her face. The color of her skin looked paler, and her energy seemed thinner. Whenever he asked if she was fine, she smiled and said she was all right. He wanted to believe her, but could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. One afternoon, she stayed late again to finish a report. The office lights glowed softly above her desk. It was quiet except for the sound of the cleaning staff mopping the floor. Ethan walked out of a meeting and saw her still working, told her to go home and rest. She looked up and nodded, but said she would leave after printing one last file. He stayed nearby for no real reason, pretending to check his messages. A few seconds later, The sound of paper stopped. Claire leaned forward, pressing a hand to her head. Her chair rolled slightly, and before she could speak, she collapsed onto the floor. Ethan rushed to her. His heart pounded as he called for help. The security guards and staff gathered quickly, and he lifted her lightly in his arms. For the first time in years, fear filled him completely. He told his driver to go fast to the hospital. At the hospital, doctors moved quickly. Ethan waited outside, unable to sit still. Lila arrived soon after, holding her backpack, her face pale from tears. She wrapped her arms around him and asked if her mother was going to wake up. Ethan could only promise that she would. He kept his arm around the girl and did not move until the doctor finally came out. The doctor said Claire had fainted from exhaustion and anemia. She would need to rest and take medicine, but she would recover if she slowed down. When Claire woke later that night, Ethan was sitting beside her bed. His suit jacket was folded on the chair and his eyes looked tired but kind. She tried to apologize, but he stopped her gently, said she had done enough and that she must take care of herself now. Her eyes filled with tears when she looked at him. She said she did not want to be a burden, not after everything he had done for her. He told her she could never be a burden to him. For a while they sat in silence. The sound of the monitor beside her kept a steady rhythm. Claire's voice trembled as she said, life had taught her not to expect much. She had raised her daughter by herself, working late to make ends meet, always afraid to ask for help. She said she feared losing what little she had worked for. Ethan listened, his hands folded tightly. He realized how small his own worries had been compared to hers. He told her that she did not have to live that way anymore. He said he wanted to be around for her and Lila in whatever way they needed. At first, she shook her head and said it was not right. He was her boss, and he had his own world. But when he reached out and touched her hand, her heart softened, did not say anything more. The look in his eyes said what words could not. When Lila walked into the room later, Claire smiled weakly and opened her arms. The little girl climbed onto the bed and rested her head against her mother's shoulder. She looked at Ethan seriously and said, "You make Mom smile. That means you are family now." Ethan tried to speak, but his voice caught. He could only nod. The next few weeks were slow and careful. Claire rested at home while Ethan arranged for a nurse to check on her. She protested, saying it was too much, but he insisted. Every evening after finishing work, he visited with groceries or books for Lila. Sometimes he helped her with school projects while Claire rested in the next room. Their small apartment began to feel like a second home for him. One evening, Claire came out to find him and Lila sitting on the floor building a cardboard castle for a class project. They were both covered in glue and laughing. For the first time, she saw how natural he looked there. Not as a boss or a businessman, but as someone who belonged in their lives. Her eyes watered, though she smiled to hide it. When Ethan stood to leave later, Claire walked him to the door. She thanked him for everything he had done. He said he should be the one thanking her. He told her that before she came into his life, he had forgotten what kindness felt like. She looked down, unable to speak. Then she said that some things were meant to find each other no matter how big the world was. As he stepped out into the evening air, Ethan knew she was right. He realized that from the moment Lila had walked into his office, that rainy morning, something inside him had changed forever. Autumn came quietly, painting the city in gold and soft brown. The leaves fell across the sidewalks like shimmered paper, and the air turned cool enough to carry the smell of roasted nuts from the street vendors. Inside Coal Industries, things had changed. The office no longer felt cold or distant. There was laughter more often, small talk around coffee breaks, and even the busiest managers now smiled once in a while. At the center of that warmth were Claire and Lila. Claire had recovered and returned to work part-time at first, then resumed full hours once her health returned. Her calm energy lifted everyone's spirits as it always had. Ethan insisted she take breaks and never overwork again. She followed his advice, partly because she was grateful, but also because she knew how deeply he cared. Lila became a familiar figure in the building after school. She made charts for the front desk, decorated message boards with drawings, and sometimes helped deliver fresh flowers to the meeting rooms. No one minded. The little girl had a way of making the place brighter without even trying. Ethan often found himself watching her skip through the hall with gentle pride he had not known before. Ethan's life had also grown fuller. He still carried his usual load of meetings and deadlines, But now his days ended with dinners that tasted like real moments instead of routine. He would drive to Claire's place in the evenings. Together, they cooked simple meals while Lila told stories about school. They watched old movies on television, or sat by the window sharing popcorn while lightning bugs blinked in the distance. One evening, while they were clearing dishes, Ethan looked at Claire and said he had something to show her the next day. She tried to ask what it was, but he only smiled and said she would see soon enough. The next morning, he drove her and Lila across the city to a newly built community center. It was fresh with paint, filled with light, and surrounded by trees. A small sign near the entrance read, Harper Family Center. Claire stopped where she stood, her hands covering her mouth. Lila ran in circles around the sign, saying her name with delight. Ethan explained that the center would help single parents find work, training, and safe care programs for children. He said it was built from an idea she had once mentioned long ago. When she told him she wanted fairness for people who never got a chance to rest, Claire turned to him with tears in her eyes. She asked why he had done this. He told her it was the right thing to do and that she had inspired it. That day, the three of them walked through the rooms of the new building. They met families waiting in line for the first registration. Claire spoke softly to a few mothers and fathers there, sharing gentle words she understood from experience. Ethan watched her and knew that she did not even see how strong she looked in those moments. As the weeks passed, the center began thriving. Claire helped run some of the programs, balancing that work with her job at the company. Lila became a helper at the children's corner, reading stories and painting tiny handprints on paper banners. Ethan visited whenever he could. He often stood outside the door watching them, feeling that life had finally found its shape. Sometimes late at night, he thought about the day when a small girl had walked into his office and changed everything. He had started that day thinking success meant bigger profits. Now he understood that success meant meaning. It meant the laughter of a child echoing down the hallway, the trust in the eyes of someone you care for, and the simple peace of doing something good. One winter evening, snow began falling outside their windows. The city lights looked soft beneath the white flakes. In the warm apartment, Claire and Lila sat by the table writing New Year cards. Ethan sat nearby reading a book. Lila looked up and asked if people who loved each other stayed together forever. Ethan smiled and said they did if they kept choosing to care, even on hard days. Claire looked at him quietly and said that sounded like a promise. He said it was. Later that night, they hung their cards by the window. Each card had a small wish written inside. Lila's card wished for happiness for everyone at the office. Claire's card wished for health and peace. Ethan's card, though written smaller, said thank you for my family. None of them mentioned it, but they all read the words when the wind flipped the pages. As winter deepened, the three of them built new days together. Claire found a rhythm between work and life that kept her balanced. Lila grew braver at school, now dreaming of leading projects instead of only joining them. Ethan learned to slow down, to listen, and to smile more often without reason. The world outside stayed busy, but inside their small circle there was steady peace. When people asked Ethan one day what had turned his life around, he told them a child had come to a job interview and brought along her mother. It sounded strange to anyone who did not know the story, but to him, that moment had been the start of everything wonderful. And as he watched Claire and Lila laughing across the room that evening, he knew their story was not ending but beginning in the way true love stories always do. It's kindness, courage, and the bright string that ties three hearts together forever.